It appears there's a technical difficulty. I'm not seeing the video on my screen. The light is lit up, which indicates my camera is working. But again, I don't see the video. However, I do see the PowerPoint displayed, and so that's beneficial because if you can see that, I've got a couple of slides to show with the class. This is lesson 11, and we're covering all of chapter 18 and a little bit of chapter 19. Last two classes looked at Jesus in the upper room with the apostles. He washed their feet. He instituted the Lord's Supper. He sent Judas out to carry out his deed. He talked to the apostles about the Holy Spirit. Then he finished with a prayer. And that concluded chapter 17. Then we read in chapter 18, verses 1 and 2, when he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So that's not a very helpful map. So I don't know if you can see that very well, but this is the Mount of Olives. This is the Kidron Valley. And this shows the Garden of Gethsemane here. And the reason I put that up is because this map, here's the temple, here's Jerusalem, Kidron Valley. Mount of Olives is here, and it locates the Garden of Gethsemane in the south area of it. Here's another one that shows the Garden of Gethsemane, I guess you'd say straight in front of them, not neither north nor south of the Garden of the Mount of Olives. Regardless, I don't know if I asked question number 1. What do we know about the garden mentioned in John 18, verses 1 and 2? Well, we're told that verse 2 that Jesus had often met there with his disciples. Matthew and Mark tell us it was called Gethsemane. It was a grove or an orchard of olive trees. And because they went there often, some people think that Jesus knew the owner. Verse 1 locates the garden on the east side of the Kidron Valley, which we've already indicated. This picture here is from Jerusalem down here at the bottom of the screen, looking eastward. And this is a church built in the 1920s called the Church of All Nations, also called the Church of the Agony. It's believed that this is built on the Garden of Gethsemane and an area around it, the whole area being about the size of a football field. This is a picture of what is believed to be the garden. These are the olive trees. There's another picture that brings in something else there. So I guess that's all I was going to mention on that. Question 2 says, what groups of people were present when Jesus was arrested? Verse 3 says, Judas came to the garden guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. Trying to be more helpful and probably accurately reflecting the meaning of the text, the New Living Translation says the leading priests and Pharisees had given Judas a contingent of Roman soldiers and temple guards to accompany him. Question 3 says, describe the conversation between Jesus and this group of men. Well, it wasn't much of a conversation, but it's obvious that Jesus was completely in control of the situation. When they approached him, Jesus asked who they were seeking. They said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said, I am he. When he said this, we're told that they drew back and fell to the ground. Some think this just indicates their natural fear of him because of his commanding presence and because of what they knew about him, his miracles and everything. Others think it had to do with Jesus having identified himself as I am, which could have been suggestive of deity, a claim to be God. Regardless, it's clear that they were quite taken aback under the circumstances and that Christ was in complete control. That was demonstrated further when Jesus said, if you're looking for me, basically you found me, here I am, let these men go. Question 4 says, what impetuous act did Peter commit in the garden? Well, this is the famous account of Peter drawing his sword and cutting off the right ear of the high priest's servant. Luke's account tells us that Jesus touched the man's ear and healed it. Question 5 says, after his arrest, where was Jesus taken and why? Verses 12 and 13 says, the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest, that year. Seems to have been a preliminary hearing since Annas was no longer the official high priest. Verse 24 tells us that he was then taken and put on trial by Caiaphas, the current high priest. But Annas asked Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Seems that his intention was to obtain evidence that could be used as a formal accusation against Christ. Question 6 says, who followed Jesus after his arrest? That would be Peter. And then it asks what happened in the courtyard. Well, the reference there to verses 15 through 18, I'll read through 17, says, Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, that would be the other disciple that's referring to, and likely John, and we'll mention that in a second. He went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. The unnamed disciple is thought to have been John, the writer of this gospel. It seems likely that he mentioned his familiarity with the high priest's family in order to explain how Peter was allowed into what seemed to be an area to which the general public was not allowed access. This is what created the situation where Peter denied Jesus. Question 7 says, what did the high priest want to know about Jesus? Well, I answered this question in question number 5, but I'll reiterate. I said that it seems that his intention was to obtain evidence that could be used as a formal accusation against Christ. Question 8 says, what did Peter discuss? I'm having trouble yawning. Sorry. What did Peter discuss with one of the servants of the high priest? Verse 26 and 27 says, one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the garden? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment a rooster began to crow. This seems to indicate further that John had very intimate knowledge about the household of the high priest. This was Peter's third denial, and this denial was probably the most defensible, because this man no doubt saw Peter strike his own relative with the sword, and he could have immediately gotten Peter arrested. Chapter 19, verses 1 through, well, actually the last little bit here of chapter 18, beginning in verse 28, then through chapter 19, verse 16, the trial before Pilate. Question 1 says, what was the praetorium, and why was Jesus taken there? Well, he was taken there to be put on trial by Pilate. The praetorium is from a Latin word meaning leader. It referred to the residence of a Roman leader. Some translations render the word palace, and that's why I have this map here. This is a blow-up of Jerusalem. This is the temple area, and this is identified here as the praetorium. This is Herod's palace here, and this is thought to be the location, if you will, of Pilate's palace in Jerusalem. So the word praetorium was wherever the Roman emperor or the Roman governor or whoever represented the Roman emperor was staying. It could be his official residence, or it could be a tent on a battlefield. In the New Testament, when it's used, it refers to the palace of Pontius Pilate. Question 2 says, describe the conversation between Pilate and the Jewish leaders. Well, Pilate wanted to know what charges they were bringing against Jesus, and since the Jews could not prove any breach of Roman law, since they could not prove any offense against the Roman state, they spoke broadly, just saying, if he were not a criminal, we would not have brought him to you. Their response seemed to imply that Pilate should just trust them. Pilate's response indicates that basically he did not trust them. He told them to take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. They made it clear that they were seeking the death penalty when they stated that they had no right to execute anyone, which is why they were having to come to Pilate. Question 3 says, what did Pilate want to know about Jesus, and what did he find out? He wanted to know if Jesus claimed to be a king. He wanted to know what Jesus had done to cause the religious leaders to hand him over to Pilate, to bring him to Pilate, to be ultimately executed, what charge they had against him. Pilate found out enough to satisfy himself that Jesus was not worthy of death. Question 4 says, who was Barabbas, and what Passover custom did he benefit from? Mark and Luke tell us that Barabbas was a well-known prisoner who had been incarcerated for taking part in an insurrection and for murder. Pilate tells us in verse 39, it is your custom, speaking to the Jews, for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of Passover. We see that he offered to release Jesus, but the Jews insisted instead that he release Barabbas. Question 5 says, why did Pilate have Jesus scourged? When comparing Luke's account with John's account, it seems apparent that Pilate had Jesus scourged to try to gain sympathy from the Jews for Jesus in order to allow Pilate to release Jesus after this punishment. Luke 23 verses 13 through 16 says, Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people and said to them, you brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he has sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore I will punish him and release him. John 19, our text, verses 1 and 4 says, Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged or scourged. And verse 4 says, once more after this, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. And then question 6 says, why was Pilate so confused? In John 19, verses 6 through 16. Well, after having had Jesus scourged, Pilate had him brought out before the crowd and said, here is the man. As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, crucify, crucify. But Pilate answered, you take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. Again, Pilate was confused for that reason. He found no fault in Jesus. Matthew 27, verses 21 through 23. Pilate, again, asking about the custom, said, which of the two do you want me to release to you? Barabbas, they answered. Then what shall I do with Jesus who is called the Messiah? Pilate asked. They all answered, crucify him. Pilate said, why? What crime has he committed? But they shouted all the louder. And so after having made several attempts to release Jesus, the Jews finally threatened to level charges of treason against Pilate if he did not crucify Jesus. John 19 verse 12 says, from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jewish leaders kept shouting, if you let this man go, You are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. Next week, we will look at the crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection of Christ. This will be section 7, Roman numeral 7, letters C, D, and E.